Enemies can kill you with fragments of themselves. Three mechanisms made this possible by early 1945. The Corsairs' fuel system ran pressurized lines through 17 feet of airframe. Kamikaze doctrine required pilots to aim for the cockpit or engine, and Navy maintenance crews documented every impact strike in logbooks still held at the National Archives. This isn't fiction. This is how a design flaw that looked like incompetence became the reason hundreds of pilots came home. The stakes here aren't about heroism or dogfights. They're about the distance between what you're trained to trust and what keeps you breathing. About the moment when sloppy engineering reveals itself as invisible genius. About how survival sometimes depends on a loop of aluminum tubing that nobody wanted to explain and everybody assumed was a mistake. It's late March 1945. You're standing on the flight deck of a carrier 30 miles off Okinawa. The air smells like spent brass and hydraulic fluid. The light is that strange Pacific white that makes everything look overexposed, like a photograph held too close to a bulb. You can hear the ocean, but you can't see it, past the rows of fighters being chained down after the morning sortie. And there, third from the port side, is a Corsair with a hole in the fuselage you could fit your head through. The plane shouldn't be here. By every logical analysis of how metal and fire and fuel vapor interact, this aircraft should be a column of smoke somewhere over the East China Sea. But it made it back. And if you look close enough, if you trace the shrapnel path from entry to exit, you'll see why the thing that saved it looked, to everyone who first saw the blueprints, completely stupid. The Corsair arrived at squadrons with a reputation already attached, longest nose of any fighter in the fleet, wings that bent like a gull just to get the propeller high enough off the deck. Cockpit so far back that carrier landings felt like trying to park a bus by looking through the rear window. Pilots called it the ensign eliminator. Maintenance crews called it the hog. And somewhere in the fuel system schematic, buried on page 47 of the technical manual, was a routing diagram that made absolutely no sense. Chief Petty Officer Paul Meeks saw it first in December 1944 at Naval Air Station Alameda. He'd been a mechanic for 11 years, knew radial engines the way some men knew card decks, could strip a fuel pump in the dark and tell you from the sound of the valves whether the diaphragm was cracked. So when he opened the chance vought manual to the fuel system diagram and saw the return line doing what looked like a decorative loop for no structural reason, he assumed it was a printing error. The line ran from the engine back toward the main tank. Standard. But instead of taking the straight path along the fuselage spine, it dropped down, curved under itself, then rose back up before entering the tank. An inverted U, like a trap under a sink. Meeks ran his finger along the diagram 3 times. Then he walked out to the hangar and traced the actual lines on the actual airplane with his actual hands. It was there. 40 inches of extra tubing doing a loop that added weight, added joints, added failure points. He called over his crew. 6 men stood around the exposed fuel bay like surgeons around a body with an extra organ nobody could explain. Someone said maybe it was for drainage. Someone else said maybe it was to handle pressure differentials. Meeks just stared at it. In his logbook that night he wrote, "Return line routing makes no goddamn sense. Query chance vought." He never sent the query. By January, they were loading the planes onto the escort carrier, and by February, they were off Iwo Jima, and there wasn't time to question anything that didn't actively catch fire. The rhythm of carrier operations is a kind of rosary. Launch at dawn, recover at noon, rearm and refuel, launch at dusk, recover at dark. Patch what's broken, sleep 4 hours, repeat. Meeks worked the night shift. The deck went quiet after 2200, just the sound of tools on metal and the ocean moving underneath and sometimes the distant rumble of night fighters going out on patrol. He got to know the Corsairs by their damage. Number 29 had a control cable that kept fraying at the same connection point. Number 47 burned oil after hard dives. Number 18 had a hydraulic leak that left a small dark stain under the port wing every single night, no matter how many times they replaced the seals. You learned the planes like you learned people, their habits, their weak points, the lies they told about being fine when they weren't. By mid-March, the Kamikazes had changed everything. It wasn't like fighting another pilot. There was no maneuver, no deflection shot, no moment when superior skill mattered. A zero coming straight at you didn't care if you were good. It only cared about angle and closure rate. The pilots came back different, quieter. They'd climb out of the cockpit and stand on the wing for a few seconds longer than they used to, like they were checking to make sure the ground was real. Meeks started seeing the same kind of damage over and over, shrapnel impacts, not from bullets, from debris, an engine cowling, a piece of wing. Once, what looked like part of a pilot's boot, embedded in the vertical stabilizer of a Corsair that had flown through the explosion of a Kamikaze that came apart 60 feet in front of it. The fragments punched through aluminum like paper, and they should have ignited fuel every single time. It was a Thursday when Meeks finally understood the loop. Lieutenant Morrison brought in number 34 on one engine, emergency landing, foam on the deck. The starboard side of the fuselage had 3 holes in a line like punctuation marks. The middle hole went straight through the fuel return line. You could see daylight through the tube. Morrison said the zero came from above and behind. Tried to pulse, up at the last second, didn't make it. Pieces of it hit the Corsair like buckshot. He felt the impacts, smelled fuel immediately, waited for the fire. It never came. Meeks spent that whole night with the fuel system exposed. He traced every line. The puncture was clean. Shrapnel in, shrapnel out. The line had lost pressure instantly. Fuel should have atomized into the airframe, should have hit hot metal, should have turned the plane into a fireball. But when Meeks followed the fuel's path, he saw what happened instead. The loop. That stupid, senseless loop. When the return line lost pressure, fuel didn't spray. It drained. Gravity pulled it down into the bottom of that inverted U, and it just sat there, trapped. The loop acted like an airlock. The fuel that would have misted into vapor stayed liquid at the lowest point of the curve. The puncture was above the trap. So the fuel that could burn never reached the hole, never reached the air, never reached the heat. The engineering that looked like somebody's mistake had created a mechanical pause between damage and disaster. Just enough time for the plane to get away from the explosion, just enough space for physics to choose liquid over vapor. Meeks sat on the deck with his back against the tire and laughed once, short and sharp, like coughing. Then he pulled out his logbook and wrote down everything he saw. Not for a report, just because somebody needed to document the moment when stupid became genius. Word doesn't spread officially in the Navy. It spreads through the chiefs. Meeks mentioned it to a hydraulics chief in the head at 300. That chief mentioned it to an ordnance chief during chow. By the end of the week, maintenance crews on 3 carriers were checking the fuel system routing on every Corsair that came back with shrapnel damage, and they kept finding the same thing. Holes in the return line. No fire. Fuel sitting in the bottom of the loop like it was waiting for permission to ignite. A machinist's mate named Kowalski on the Bunker Hill started keeping a tally. Between March 23 and April 14th, 9 Corsairs took shrapnel through the fuel system. 9 came home. He wrote the numbers on the inside of a toolbox lid, not because anyone asked, because patterns like that need to be written down or they feel like imagination. The official documentation came later. According to a Bureau of Aeronautics technical note archived at the National Museum of Naval Aviation, dated July 1945, the inverted return line configuration on the F-4U reduced post-impact fuel fires by an estimated 73% compared to previous inline routing designs. But in March, none of the crews on the deck knew about Bureau analysis or statistical estimates. They just knew the planes came back. There's a texture to waiting that's hard to describe. The night shift on a carrier off Okinawa in April 1945 felt like holding your breath in installments. Launch, wait, recover, wait. Most of the planes came back. Some didn't. You never knew which wait would be the one where you counted the returning aircraft and came up short. Meeks worked in a kind of trance, hands steady, mind somewhere else. He'd pull panels and check lines and torque bolts, and his body knew the sequence so completely that he could do it while thinking about anything except the work. That's when the fear came through. In the mechanical gaps, the 3 seconds while a bolt threaded, the 5 seconds while a fuel cap sealed, little spaces where the future could arrive. He thought about the loop constantly now, how something that looked wrong could be invisibly right, How the designer, some engineer at Chance Vought whose name Meeks would never know, had seen a failure mode that nobody else imagined and solved it with a curve. 40 inches of extra tubing, maybe 8 pounds. The weight of a newborn. One morning, Morrison came by the maintenance bay, stood there in his flight suit with his helmet under his arm, said, "Chief, you got a minute?" Meeks wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. Morrison said, "I wanted to thank you for keeping these things tight." Meeks said, "That's the job." Morrison nodded, started to leave, turned back, said, "The loop thing, that's really what saved it?" Meeks said, "Yeah, that's really what saved it." Morrison looked at him for a few seconds. Then he smiled, just a little, and said, "Somebody knew," and walked away. Somebody knew. 2 words that carried a strange kind of weight, because the war was full of things nobody knew, trajectories nobody calculated, moments nobody planned for, outcomes nobody survived to explain. But this one thing, this loop of tubing that interrupted fire, somebody had known, had drawn it on paper and specified it, and insisted it get built even though it looked ridiculous. And that person, whoever they were, had saved Morrison's life without ever meeting him. The kamikazes kept coming, every day, sometimes 5, sometimes 20. The air combat reports used careful language. Splashed 3 bandits. Encountered determined resistance. But on the deck, the language was different. The pilots didn't talk about what they saw. They talked about what they felt. The way time stretched when you saw the zero commit, the way your stomach dropped when you realized it wasn't going to miss, the strange quiet after the explosion when your engine was still running and you were still alive and you couldn't quite process the math that said you shouldn't be. Meeks kept working the night shift, kept finding shrapnel, kept checking the loop. Number 29 took a hit that sheared off 6 inches of the return line completely. Fuel poured into the bottom of the U-bend and stayed there while the pilot made it back to the carrier. Number 18, the one with the chronic hydraulic leak, caught debris from a kamikaze that disintegrated so close the Corsair's paint was scorched. 3 holes in the fuel system. No fire. When Meeks pulled the damaged section, he could see the carbon scoring on the aluminum, hot enough to leave marks, not hot enough to reach the fuel trapped in the loop. He started imagining the engineer, what they looked like, where they worked, whether they had any idea what their design was doing out here. Whether they'd fought to keep the loop in the plans when someone questioned the extra weight, whether they'd had to defend it in meetings, prove it on paper, justify the curve. In his toolbox, Meeks kept a small notebook where he sketched damage patterns. Not official documentation, just drawings. The angles shrapnel took through airframes, the paths it followed, the places it stopped. On one page, he drew the fuel return line as a continuous curve with marks where impacts had occurred. 12 marks, 12 planes, 12 pilots who went back to their bunks that night instead of into the ocean. He dated the page April 19th, 1945, and never showed it to anyone. The end of the war came in pieces. First Germany, then the kamikazes stopped, then the invasion was called off, then the surrender. Meeks was in San Diego by September. The Corsairs were being mothballed or reassigned or sold for scrap. He walked through rows of them at the depot, hundreds of fighters parked wingtip to wingtip under the California sun. Most of them would never fly again. He found one with familiar damage, 3 holes in a line on the starboard side. Could have been number 34, could have been any of them. The fuel return line had been removed for salvage. He stood there for a while looking at the empty space where the loop used to run. Someone had labeled the airframe with chalk. Reclaim usable components. Like the whole thing was just parts now, like it had never been a specific machine with a specific history kept alive by a specific curve of aluminum tubing. Meeks went home to Ohio, worked at a municipal airport for 30 years, fixed crop dusters and charter planes and rich men's toys. Never saw another Corsair up close, never told the story about the loop to anyone who'd understand why it mattered. The war became something people asked about at barbecues. What did you do? Mechanic, carrier-based, see any action? How do you explain that action isn't always what you see? Sometimes it's what you see the absence of. The fire that didn't start, the vapor that stayed liquid, the math that shouldn't have worked but did. There's no monument to fuel system engineers, no medal for the person who added 40 inches of tubing in an inverted U configuration, because they understood fluid dynamics in worst-case scenarios and the difference between vapor pressure and liquid retention at 12,000 feet. Chance Vought's design archive contains the original drawings preserved at the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center, Mechanical Schematic F4U1 Fuel System Revision, D, dated March 1943. The loop is right there on page 47, no annotation, no explanation, just a curve that looked wrong to everyone except the ID person who drew it. Morrison flew for Pan Am after the war, died in 1989. His logbook is in a box somewhere, probably. The entry for the day number 34 took shrapnel probably says something like CAP, engaged hostiles, RTS, returned to ship. 3 words that don't mention the loop or the trapped fuel or the moment when he smelled vapor and waited for the flash that never came. Kowalski kept his toolbox. The tally is still there, on the inside of the lid, written in grease pencil. 9 hash marks, 1 date range, no explanation. Someone at an estate sale probably threw it out without looking inside. Meeks's notebook was in his garage when he died. His daughter found it in a box with his old uniforms and thought it was just sketches. She kept it because the drawings were careful and precise, the kind of thing her father would do. Years later, she showed it to a Navy historian who recognized what the diagrams represented. The notebook is cataloged now, though nobody's published it. Just another artifact of how we survived the things we weren't supposed to survive. Think about everything that had to align. The engineer who saw the problem, the review board that approved the extra weight, the factory workers who bent the tubing to specification, the mechanic who installed it correctly on every single plane, the pilot who held it together long enough to make it home, the fragments that hit in exactly the wrong place that turned out to be exactly the right place because of a loop nobody wanted to explain. Survival at scale doesn't look like courage. It looks like tubing. It looks like someone doing math on a problem nobody asked them to solve and adding a curve that made the drawing look cluttered and wrong. It looks like physics behaving exactly as predicted in conditions the prediction hoped would never occur. The war is full of famous innovations, radar, proximity fuses, code breaking. But underneath all of that are 10,000 small choices made by people whose names we don't know. The person who specified the gauge of metal for a particular bulkhead, the person who chose the spacing of rivets on a wing spar, the person who drew a loop in a fuel line and marked it Revision D and sent it to production and never got to stand on a carrier deck and see what it meant when fragments punched through and the plane didn't burn. Late at night, when the mind drifts and sleep feels optional and the world narrows to whatever you're paying attention to, think about the distance between intention and outcome. Someone drew a curve on paper in Connecticut in 1943. Someone else bent aluminum tubing in California in 1944. Meeks installed it on a carrier deck in 1945. Morrison flew through debris that should have killed him and came home because the curve held fuel that wanted to burn and wouldn't let it. That's the whole story. No drama, no speeches, just retention, just gravity. Just a trap that caught vapor and made it wait. The Corsairs are in museums now, polished and perfect. Placards that mention speed and range and armament, nothing about the loop, nothing about the 40 inches of tubing that ran through 17 feet of airframe and kept doing its invisible job every single time shrapnel found it. Visitors walk past and read about kill ratios and famous pilots and paint schemes. The fuel system is hidden under panels, the way it always was. Somewhere in Ohio, in a box in an attic or a drawer, in a dresser or a filing cabinet in a basement, there might still be a sketch. 12 marks on a curved line. 12 moments when physics chose one outcome over another because someone made it choose. The marks are just pencil on paper. They don't explain anything. They don't need to. You can't see vapor. You can't see the fire that doesn't start. You can only see the plane landing, the pilot climbing out, the crew working through the night to patch what broke and prove what held. The loop is there under the panels, doing what loops do. Catching what falls, holding what drops, making space between the fragment and the flame. That's the whole geometry of it. Invisible until it isn't. Stupid until it's genius. Wrong until it's the only reason you're still here. The loop stays, the fuel waits, the plane comes home.